Good evening, everybody. Mike Geary here for the Geek Podcast on this Monday evening. We're back to Mondays after a very weird Sunday thing that went on last week. But it wasn't even last week; it was the week before. We're doing these bi-monthly now, I think. Bi-monthly?
Yes, Matt. We are indeed doing it bi-monthly.
Bi-monthly.
We've just been doing bi-monthly now for about 6 months. Just put it out there.
I'm getting old, man. What can I say? I'm getting old. All right,
I'm old too. I can remember more than you.
Yeah, well, yeah, my memory is shocking, absolutely shocking. Anyway, with me tonight, we have my co-host, Peter Ray Allison.
Good evening, everyone.
And back again, our special guest, Jonathan Green.
Hello.
So, Jonathan, for those who have been living under a rock or who didn't listen to the podcast last time, who are you? What do you do? What's your thing?
So, my name's Jonathan Green, and I am a freelance writer, but I'm best known these days for writing adventure game books, which is ironically what I started out doing 30 years ago. So my first Fighting Fantasy game book was published in June 1993, and I've just had another game book published, and I've lost count. I think it's like number 24 or something, but I've done tie-in fiction, so this one actually is a game book that ties into a well-known brand, as we'll discuss later on. And I write histories of Fighting Fantasy game books. I've written steampunk novels, all sorts of things. Yeah.
And you have a super, like, you're looking at what is the tip of the iceberg, the literary iceberg. When you see the sort of, he's got two minor shells, but if he pans his camera around the other way, you've got like 1, 2, full, more books. Books galore.
Yes. Shelves.
Oh, glorious.
Yeah.
Glorious.
It's the new office, which I've moved into. We moved past
you
in the
write
summer.
game books. It's true. But it's like, that's like saying Picasso paints a ceiling. You are the eminent authority on game books. You wrote, you are the hero. Yeah. You organise Fighting Fantasy Fest.
That's right. Yes.
Which is a celebration of Fighting Fantasy game books. So it's a bit more than just, I write game books.
Yeah, I write books about game books. I run conventions about game books. Yes.
On a random note, just because of all the books and stuff you've got there, what is your go-to type of book when obviously you're not writing and I guess reading game books and stuff? Is there a type? For me, like I enjoy historical books. I'm very into my historical books, and I quite enjoy my sort of sci-fi and fantasy sort of epics. What about yourself? What tickles the fancy?
I do enjoy historical whodunits. So along the lines of Ellis Peters' Brother Cadfael novels.
Cadfael! Wow.
Doomsday. Yeah. Michael Jeck's Templar series, all those sort of things. I also, because I'm a writer, I know lots of other writers, so I do read my friends' books from time to time. When we meet up in the pub and recommend books to each other or find out what they're writing. So yeah, I've got quite a few signed copies, which is nice as well. So yes, not hard sci-fi. I read some sort of weirder fiction. Book I'm reading at the moment, I've almost finished, is The Way In by Will Wiles, which starts out about a bloke who goes to conventions so you don't have to, as in not exciting conventions like we attend, but ones like for, I don't know, sink manufacturers or something like that.
Okay.
So it's those sort of dull things, but it then becomes something very different, and I don't want to spoil it because it's really good.
Yeah. Have you ever read the Haven, Hawk and Fisher novels by Simon Green?
No.
It's basically done as like a fantasy historical whodunit, but as if the detectives were Riggs and Murtaugh.
Oh, okay.
So it's quite interesting. It's not the traditional detective types.
Yeah.
They're more like kind of just kicking doors and then demand questions.
Yeah.
So it's really delightfully gung-ho and very unconventional in terms of detective stories, but there is a mystery there to be solved, which is quite fun.
Yeah, I do enjoy a good mystery. including things like Sarah Pimbra's Behind Her Eyes. You know, the twist at the end of that, and it's one of those things where I thought I've worked this out, and yet I hadn't. There were levels beyond that, but then as soon as you know the truth without spoiling it, it's right there from the start. It's very, very cleverly done. So I enjoy those sort of things and I inevitably I kind of second guessing. My family hate it because if we're watching any sort of crime drama on the TV, I'll go, well, they did it. And my daughter particularly hates it. Death in Paradise is the worst. And generally, because it's the most famous guest actor, that's the only reason I'm basing it on at all. But she doesn't know they're famous. So.
Yeah, I was watching an episode of Elementary during the second season. Which is a fun.
I thought Elementary was pretty good.
It's well acted,
yeah,
but it's got the writing let it down, especially in like the start and midway of the second season, where I was guessing the entire plot based on my understanding of television industry and writing, and like, well, it's going to be one of the speaking guests. It's going to be, a process of elimination, and I kind of just once I got it figured out the entire thing before the first act had finished, and so I gave up at that point.
Yeah, it's.
Yeah, it makes me think about Deep Blue Sea, which is not a great film by any stretch of imagination. But when you've got, this is a spoiler, but Samuel L. Jackson, the biggest star in the film, when he dies, like at the end of the first reel, you think, okay, anybody's fair game now.
Yeah, well, that's it. Thing is, part of me likes it. It's like I kind of enjoy it when I'm like, I feel like I'm the shit and I've written the script. It's like I wrote the script and stuff. You sit there and you go, I knew exactly what was going to happen, and you wrote the script, and you kind of enjoy it that way. But also, like, I'm listening to Pierce Brown's Red Rise into the sixth book. What's it called? Lightbringer, which has just come out, and like I was completely just like, right, this is gonna happen, and it didn't. Something else completely happened, and I was just like, that's fucking awesome. I love it when it gets you. I love them when they just sort of kind of they have you believing like you're a fucking I've got this worked out. I've got this completely worked out, and then they just throw a spanner in the works, and you're just like, wow, okay, yeah, that's epic.
Did anyone ever watch Person of Interest? That was a really good take on procedural detective stories, where basically the whole presumption was Finch has designed this kind of super program algorithm that can, predict crime, but it generates a number, like the social security number of that person, but you don't know whether they're going to be the victim or the perpetrator.
Right.
So that was quite neatly done, because it's a bit more added dimension there of like, okay, we've got to investigate this person, but we don't know whether the bad guy or the good guy. And like the story develops from there into AI, surveillance and all that. But just that premise was just so neatly done. Mm-hmm. And if you go, well, it's a perpetrator. I don't know whether the bad guys or whether they're going to be the good guys. And so the entire first act of working out, who are they? I don't know.
Yeah.
Like I've got, so I grew up on like this reading Sharp and like Lord of the Rings and things like that, and you sort of have this like the hero's going to survive, the hero's going to win, and he's going to do his thing, and there's no real sort of, it's very gung-ho and stuff like that. But then I started reading, like, my first ever like big shock read of like, holy shit, what have they just done, was obviously the Song of Ice and Fire series. And like, when he started just killing off people who you like and love, and you're just like, oh my god, what the hell are you doing? And then I've got to a point now where I like my books to have twists in them. If I don't get a twist, and I feel cheated, and it's just like everything I do, and I watch now as well, and I quite like the new Poirot films, with Kenneth Branagh. Yeah, and I just kind of like there. I know you didn't get the last one quite. What was it? Was it the last one? Death in the Nile? Was it Death in the Nile?
Yeah, it wasn't. I mean, if it had been a detective story with Kenneth Branagh as the just as a detective, fine. But because it was meant to be an adaptation of Death on the Nile, it wasn't faithful at all. Like they're bringing in these random elements that had no bearing at all on the story, that had never been established before in the books. Like he was in World War One.
Yeah.
No. And he was suffering PTSD. There were some nice bits where he kind of exhibited what's the word? Like frustration when things weren't set out correctly, because he was a very kind of
autistic. He's on spectrum.
Autistic,
yeah.
Exactly and they kind of portrayed that, and they portrayed him like raging, and Poirot does not get angry. He gets frustrated. Like there's times when he'll stamp his cane down and just a briefest moment of just a retort, but doesn't stand there and rage. So I just found it was too deviated from the established character.
Yeah.
And I can see what Kenneth was doing, but I just don't think he was trying to take his take on it. For me personally, as someone who's
I quite enjoyed it. I'll watch the third one.
I'm going to watch the third one because it's got Michelle Yeoh in it.
Yeah,
and I'm hoping she does kung fu.
They have her in everything now. Like after Everything Everywhere All at Once, she just became the Hollywood's darling. Her and oh god, played Short Round and played David.
Yes.
What's his name? Oh, this is really bad.
I've forgotten as well now, but he was really good, wasn't he?
Yeah, that's
he was
really...
brilliant. But I'll say one thing though. I mean, I think she's getting the recognition she's deserved for a long time. I mean, don't forget, she's been in everything. She's been in Bond Girls in the 90s, and what people forget is she's one of the few people to out Jackie Chan. When filming Police Story 3, which starred Michelle Yeoh opposite Jackie Chan, is like, she kind of rode this motorcycle on top of a speeding, and jumped onto a speeding train and landed a motorcycle on it. And because of that, Jackie Chan realized, hang on, you are outdoing me in my own film. So they actually had a helicopter chase over a city with Jackie Chan hanging from a rope ladder that was attached to the helicopter, just to outdo her.
Oh.
Yeah, she. To be honest, they offered Jackie Chan Everything Everywhere All at Once, and oh god, what's his bloody name? I'm gonna have to Google it now. This is really bad. It is Ke Huy Quan. They got him in just because Jackie Chan said no. And like after the film, she sent them all these messages going, you missed out on and stuff. But yeah.
I think the general phase was you're lost, bud.
Yeah, pretty much. But yeah, sorry, that's a massive segue from sort of like sort of crime. On back on the sort of the crime side of things. Knives Out. Did you like Knives Out?
Yes, I did.
The most recent one as well, which is
Glass Onion.
Yeah. I really enjoyed both of them. Yeah, I thought they're really good.
Yeah.
Right. Anyway, so back to you and game books. So you've got a new one coming out, Moon Knight: Age of Anubis. Tell us about it.
So it's a Marvel Multiverse Missions game book published by Aconite Books, and it's the third in the series. So the first two were written by Tim Dinopoulos, and it was You Are Not Deadpool and She-Hulk Goes to Murderworld. And the publisher, Aconite, is Mark Gascoigne, who many moons ago I worked with on Fighting Fantasy, and we co-wrote 2 Sonic the Hedgehog game books together. So when they started doing the Multiverse Missions books, he asked me if I would do a technical check on the Deadpool and the She-Hulk book. And then in due course, they asked if I would be up for writing one myself. And to begin with, because it was the first time they'd done it, they'd gone quite tentatively with characters who had a history of breaking the fourth wall, so talking to the reader. And the premise is that the reader is somebody who joins the superhero. That's why it says you are not Deadpool. You don't play the part of Deadpool. You're his foil, but you get to help to make decisions. And they do it with She-Hulk, where you're a trainee attorney, whatever it is, and basically She-Hulk's testing you, so you can decide what happens next, but ultimately she's going to get you out of any problems. But having gone with the comedy route, they felt more confident they could do something, I would say grittier, but a more conventional game book where there's a problem to solve and baddies to battle. So they came to me and they said, "This is what we want to do." Apparently, at the time, Marvel were quite keen to do another Deadpool one, but they said, "But equally, what would you, think of some characters you'd like to write about?" So, of course, you think about all your favourite superheroes. So I thought Iron Man, Hulk, Spider-Man, Ghost Rider, and obviously because they said Deadpool, brainstorm something for that. But then, having sort of worked some vague ideas out, and I mentioned this to my editor, they did come back and say, Spider-Man, no, because that's Marvel's. He's their pride and joy. He's their most valuable property, so nobody gets to do Spider-Man just like that.
Yeah.
So you never know in the future. And then they'd actually come back and said they'd be quite up for seeing something with either Moon Knight or Doctor Strange in, which I thought would never be an option, because the fact they just had, I think at the time, the Moon Knight show just finished.
Yeah.
And the Doctor Strange, the second film, had been out, and I thought that's too good an opportunity to miss. So I worked up outlines for both characters, and they effectively went away. So I'd got my Moon Knight, Doctor Strange, and Deadpool ideas, and they went with Moon Knight. So I then went ahead and drew up a full proposal outline, and it was a bit of toing and froing with Marvel to make sure it was all approved, because you sort of put in, these are my ideal characters I'd like to include, but if for some reason I can't, these are secondary characters. So most of them, the ones I wanted, made it into the book, which is brilliant. One or two I couldn't use for various different reasons, not all of which I'm party to, the reasons for that. And other times they would then suggest, but how about this instead, which was quite cool. So, I mean, to be honest, to be playing in the Marvel sandbox at all was awesome. And to do something as of the moment as Moon Knight was really exciting. And also because I think the character of Mark Spector with his different alters, his dissociative identity disorder, was something which actually they wanted to explore in the book. They weren't going to shy away from that. So how to make that work in a game book and still be tactful is not the right word, respectful, but deal with it with care, I suppose, but without that's it, but without sort of avoiding the situation. And I think what we did worked. So I've waffled on, I know, for ages now, but basically the premise is that you are an Egyptologist. There's a new exhibition in New York in the museum, and you're in charge of this exhibition. And while you're doing the final check before it opens the next day, a sarcophagus bursts open, and the living mummy comes out of it. And just as you're dealing with that, Moon Knight crashes through the skylight and battles the mummy, and it takes it from there. So you end up having to accompany Moon Knight. There's a good reason given why you have to do that, to then find out what the mummy's doing, what its ultimate aim is, and how it all links back to Anubis. So
one thing I want to ask is, when you kind of game books are based have combat elements into it. So
Yes.
it's just like as in the classic Fighting Fantasy. How do you so when you do combat, are you running combat for yourself, or are you running combat for Moon Knight?
Sometimes we can sort of fudge it. A lot of the time it's Moon Knight, but it's also implied at times that you're a team. So it's between the two of you. But obviously the implication being that the superhero is doing most of the actual fighting. But so there's things, it's handled differently from Fighting Fantasy, but you have three main qualities for the superhero. So in the case of Moon Knight, it's might, which is obviously combat related, and strength. You have mystic, which is more to do with persuasion and esoteric knowledge. And you have mind, which is your ability to concentrate. And different things that you can choose or that might happen can affect those stats to go up or down. Unlike Fighting Fantasy, if it goes below 0, the character doesn't die. It just makes the tests later on much harder. So you can, depending on how the character's developing, you can actually make different choices in the book. So if your Moon Knight is particularly mighty, you can go that route. Or if he's better at the mind powers, you can go make different choices. It might not be obvious at the time which the choices are, of course. But yeah, so you have these situations where it says like you're in a fight, you've got to first do this test to see if you get that. And then if you pass that test, it gives you a bonus on the other bit. But it's all explained within the text. So rather than being complicated section of rules, not that complicated in game books, but it's kind of more in the moment. And as a result, you can sort of vary things depending on what you're trying to simulate.
Okay. And I mean, I assume the might, mind, and mystic elements are kind of shared between all the Marvel game books, like Aconite.
No, so they have 3, but they vary. What they're called depends on the different characters. So, for example, in Deadpool, you have Merc, Mouth, and Focus. She-Hulk gets power, charm, and concentration. And so Moon Knight, just because I'm me, I wanted to make them all start with the letter M. So if I did, so they effectively all serve the same purpose, but you can kind of tweak it slightly to suit that character and that tone.
Was Moon Knight?
But also it means you can have battles where rather than in Fighting Fantasy, you're rolling your skill and you're deducting points or from your stamina or the enemy stamina. In these books, you can have a battle which involves more than one stat at the same time. So you can add your might and your mystic together. So, for example, if some sort of more supernatural battle going on, and then roll dice to see how they compare. So that's quite fun. It gives you a few more options.
Was Moon Knight a character you knew much about before writing the book? Like, he's not one of the main roster superheroes. Is he somebody you had to do some research on, or did you have sort of nerd knowledge about him previously?
I didn't know much. I knew he was a thing. I knew that he appeared, I think, first in Werewolf by Night. I used to think he's a bit weird character to be called Moon Knight. It's kind of that clash of American culture with other things. But then when I knew a little, but very little. But then I watched the Marvel TV series, which obviously one take on the character. But I was very intrigued, and what pleased me was that a lot of the as I looked into it more, a lot of the ancient Egyptian mythology was, I know there are some vagaries, but was quite well handled, I thought.
Yeah.
It didn't shy away from the accuracy of that, because bizarrely, my university dissertation was called Myth and Symbol in Ancient Egyptian Art.
Wow. Wow.
So you're really kind of
fine. Yeah. So I liked that, and then obviously I had to do some more research on it, and I did read up on the more recent runs of the character in the comics. Particularly Lemire, is it? I'm trying to think. I've got them on my shelf over there, but which I think they took a lot of that for the actual show, with the whole element of Mark Spector's, dissociative identity disorder, and where he thinks he's in a sanitarium or an asylum and not quite sure what's going on. So that's
there's been a lot of kind of iterations on the whole Mark Spector character, and how Moon Knight surfaces from him, whether he is like a separate personality, whether he's sort of like a spirit, whether he's like a spirit of like the Moon Knight that inhabits his body, like sort of on possession. And yeah, it's kind of like how it's changed over time.
Mm. Well, sometimes Khonshu's almost treated as one of his alters, isn't he? And other times he's a completely separate entity. In this one, Khonshu talks to you throughout the book, and you kind of get odd glimpses of him. But yes, I do use those three distinct personalities of Mark's as well. And something else which you have in the book are qualities. And it's quite a nice mechanic. This is something that the team at Aconite had come up with before for the other books. But it means it's effectively like having lots of other little scores, but you don't have to worry about them beforehand. It's only as they become relevant. And you might not know what they do during the book either, so I'm slightly wary to give too much away. But I used some of those. So, for example, I think it's in Deadpool. There's one that's called Nobbled Guns. So the more things you do to mess up the gun running trade that's going on in the story, that has an impact later on. So you have all these quirky names for different things, but I've used those so that different actions which you choose or how you react to Moon Knight will start to bring the different personalities to the fore. And as you get into the book, you might be more aware of that, and then you can choose what you want to do. So if you want him to be, it's more likely that Jake Lockley is going to show up and with his ultra violence, or if it's going to be Stephen Grant and his deeper knowledge of things. So you can manipulate things that way.
How much did the TV series influence your portrayal of Moon Knight? Because I mean, for me, Khonshu, voiced by what was it voiced by?
Murray Abraham.
Yeah, it was just brilliant. It was so disparagingly wonderful, or wonderfully disparaging.
I definitely had his voice in my head when I had Khonshu saying his bits. I'd say it's a mixture. I guess primarily it's the comics, because that's always the source material.
Yeah.
But yes, it was interesting to see how they did it. And I also, the Mr. Knight personality does appear briefly in my book. One reviewer was quite excited when he suddenly stumbled across that. And it's only for like a brief bit, but he's in there too, because I think I just quite like the design of the character for the TV show. But what's nice about the multiverse missions, because they're called multiverse, is they exist in their own little bubble universe.
Yeah.
So you don't have to tie into the continuity of the comics or the TV show or anything. And it also means that you can use characters who maybe aren't entirely alive in the current continuity.
Ooh.
But I won't give any more away.
So it gives you a lot of freedom in like how you approach it, who can appear in it.
Yeah, it's just being true to the characters, and obviously it's things like Encounter the Living Mummy. Sometimes he's an enemy, and sometimes he's one of the good guys when he's like with the other monsters. But it just depends on the story. It's like I remember Al Ewing being interviewed about who's stronger, Hulk or I think it was Wolverine or Hulk or Thing, and it's like, well, it depends on the story.
Yeah.
Who's going to win? It's purely narrative driven. It's not actually let's see who's actually the tougher one. It's not whose story it is and who we want to be the winner. That's who wins.
Very true.
Well, yeah, because I mean, like DC regularly used to kind of have that question of who was faster, the Flash or Superman, and the point where they actually had dedicated issues of them having a race around the world.
Yeah, I saw the animated one of that. That was quite amusing. Ray freezes. What doesn't he freeze? What happens? They both get frozen or something, and then like the Flash uses his like super vibrations to get through the ice. Mad.
So I was
going to say, Moon Knight always reminds me of. I'd literally just watched the last episode before we did a podcast. We were doing the podcast and talking about it, and I was all these questions. It's like, well, he's that guy, and he's this guy, and like John Joe just turns around and goes, "Did you not see the after credit scene?" And I went, "Oh my god, rookie mistake out of all Marvel things," and I didn't see the last thing, so I had to go mid. I literally had to leave the podcast, go and watch it, and then come back, and so I could talk about it. It was really amusing because I was just like, I can't believe I did that. I can't believe I didn't see that last thing.
So actually, do you have like a post credit scene in the book or like a?
No, but there are alternative endings, and there are alternative successful endings.
Oh, nice.
This is again something which the Aconite team had already established, but it's quite nice. You get star ratings, so as you play the book, you can acquire achievements as you would in a video game, and they're not always for doing the good things. And then when you get to the back of the book and you tick off what you've done, you can find out the ones super achievements. So there's things like finding all the death sections in the book gives you an achievement. So it's failing as well can help you be a completist. But you get these 5-star ratings. So I'm sure it's 1 to 5. I'm trying to remember that because I wasn't I wrote it, and I've written a few other books since. But so you can have a successful ending. So there's one, without giving too much away, where the ultimate outcome is positive, but you don't survive. So that's obviously the worst positive ending you can get. And then there's the absolute tip top when you want to get. So that's something else that you can try and do. Yeah. Actually, because you mentioned as well about the character, you don't have to know anything about Moon Knight to read the book. So it's one of those things where if you do know the character, hopefully you'll go, oh, I know what this is, or I remember that story, or oh, I know what's about to happen now. But there's enough explained that to give you an idea. If you don't know what's going on, it gives you a bit of background as it goes along.
But that's easier said than done because Moon Knight has a very relatively complex background.
Well, part of it is the character that you play in the book. You live in New York in the Marvel universe, so you are aware of superheroes and you recognize Moon Knight, but you don't know very much about him. So it gives an excuse for the character to ask questions, which are then answered one way or another throughout the book. Yeah. But like I say, there's Easter eggs for people who know the Marvel universe in more greater depth.
I think it's like all characters have multiple arcs and multiple sort of kind of multiversal versions of themselves. So you can I think you can get away with most things when it comes to Marvel. If somebody starts moaning about it, it's like, well, if you think about this arc or this arc, you can go anywhere with them. They've done pretty much everything.
Oh, there was because obviously their manuscript has to be approved by Marvel, by the team there. But there was one reference I put in, just a throwaway comment about, and I put Super Friends. And I got the feedback saying, no DC. It's like, oh, whoops. So, yeah. These days, it's gotta be Marvel.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
What are the characters you didn't like? Obviously, there was ones in there that you were like, which ones did you want in and didn't get to put in?
Oh, I'm trying to think now. Morbius,
Right, okay.
Living Vampire.
Living
That was one which was a no. I'm trying to. Man Thing as well.
Right, okay.
But because he'd been in the TV show recently, I think possibly they might have other plans, Sony. But that was a no. I'm trying to remember now. There was another one later in the adventure, and I can remember who replaced him, but I don't want to give that away. But I've forgotten. Yeah, but there's a typical, traditionally accepted heroes and villains in the book.
Okay.
So you meet other good guys other than just Moon Knight.
All right, nice.
Yeah, I mean, structurally, I think Final Fantasy set the precedent of having 400 sections in each book. Is that the same for Moon Knight? Oh,
No, so there's 300.
okay.
And it's a 3-act structure, so your typical novel structure with bottlenecks, and it roughly works out that it's a pretty even third for each part of the book. So, but that's something which I normally, with my own game books now, I kind of have a loose act structure. It might be more than 3, because some of mine have got stupidly long. But yeah, these are 300 sections, and it will be the same for my next one. Should be.
That sort of kind of ties in. I'm pretty. We've probably talked about this the last time you were on, but as my brain, as have we seen my brain is malfunctioning, and how does it work when it comes to writing a game book? In that, obviously, you sort of goes go-to page, whatever. So how do you organize it so it doesn't sort of, as you who's writing it understands how where you're going? Obviously, I guess us who are reading it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter which page we're going to. But for yourself, when you're writing it, how do you make sense of it? How do you get it in a sort of cohesive order?
So I know of a couple of people who do it completely differently from me. But the way I do is I write it in order. So section 1 will go into sections 2 and 3 and so on, and expand that way. Because that way I always keep track of where I am or how much I've got left of the adventure to write. And I don't muddle it up at all at that point. Beyond, obviously, there's going to be some jumps around depending on how things link up. And I always leave some more inconsequential encounter till the end. So I'll finish writing the main adventure, and then I'll have this extra bit so that I know I can then tailor that to the right number of sections. So that's how I make sure it fits. So something where I could expand it if I want to, or I could cut it down if needs be. So all the important stuff, if you want to have, then I don't run out of sections, or you don't get some weird number. That said, I have added kind of 100 sections to some of my Ace game books to make it work. But I've got this thing about it being a nice round number. So having done that, I will then go back and muddle it up. But I know people say, well, there's software for this. And one guy was telling me about his game book software, which sounds absolutely amazing. And it's not Twine, it's more tailored for game books. But when I asked him, does it do this? And he'd say, yes. Well, does it do this? Yes. Does it do this, this, and this? No. Because I'm very old school. So I will literally print out a copy of the book and I'll renumber it by hand and then go through and restructure it, which is probably rather laborious, but I'm almost 52 now, so it's too late to change. But it's part of my process. So I have, particularly with, not with the Moon Knight book, it does have some small filler illustrations, but with a Fighting Fantasy game book, one of my own Ace game books, I will have a certain number of illustrations, and I want to space them evenly throughout the book. But then you also have sections which are dependent on being the solution to a puzzle or some information you've given or a code word. So they have to have certain numbers. And I also now try and make it that you don't necessarily jump backwards and forwards too much, because some of my books are pretty chunky. So I'll try and keep the sections within a relatively close number so that it's just physically manipulating the book is easier than it might be otherwise. So when you add all those factors in, and the fact that sometimes the illustration will also be the answer to a puzzle, or it's got to be, you can get there if you've deducted a certain number from you're playing a specific character. So it can take quite a long time to work all that out. But then having done that, like I say, I restructure the book and send off to my proofreader and play testers who check that all the links work and none of them are broken. Do you
do flowcharts? The sort of
I do.
Yeah. Oh, good old flowchart.
This isn't Moon Knight. This is my folder for Dracula Curse of the Vampire.
Wow.
I possibly talked about
Wow.
last time.
That's
my
meaty.
longest game book to date. It's 1,000 sections long.
Wow.
But these are the flowcharts. So there's my my renumbering. I don't know if you can see that. Probably not in the terrible light. It's all far too bright.
All
You
right.
can possibly
Yeah,
see.
I can see it, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah. So there's pages and pages of handwritten, scribbled on. It's all by hand. So when I started out writing game books, I kind of made up a little bit more as I went along. Whereas now, when I start a scene, I will draw the flowchart for it first, then I'll write it. But inevitably, the flowchart changes as I write it as well.
Yeah. Do you ever get to
lots and lots of flowcharts?
Do you ever get to a point where you've done a flowchart and they've all branched off into the right things, but then you've had to change something which has a detrimental effect to the rest of the branches?
I try not to do that. I have had one or two, where you have to really go back and unpick it, or some number then doesn't work, or it's caused a problem later on. I've had it sometimes with code words where I do it less now, but I had a propensity in the past for doing, the converting the word into numbers using A equals 1, B equals 2, and so on. And then I realised I'd used it for something else, so I then just added at the end, calculate this, and then times the result by 2. Because then it gave me another option I could turn to.
One thing I was asking, does the fact like say, Final Fantasy game books are usually 400 sections, but with it being 300, does that kind of change the flow or structure of the story?
No, because the combat and dice rolls work differently, it probably balances out. Because when you've got Fighting Fantasy, for example, it'll say test your luck, and that branches to 2 other options. That isn't a mechanic that's used in the Moon Knight books, and the combat sections, you'll get a set of instructions, but it will all be within the same section, and then it's just at the end of all of that. Whereas in other game books, that might have been split across various dice rolls and various pages. So no, I think there's as much story in Moon Knight as there is in one of my early Fighting Fantasy books.
Also, how long does it take you to write the typical game book? From initial conception all the way through to publication.
That's a tricky one. The one I'm going to write next, I think I found the notes for it. I plotted it something like 7 years ago. I started working on it, and then I left it. I haven't been working on it the whole time by any means, and I made some more notes in April. But when it actually comes to the writing process, I guess it's about 3 months. But there are more intense bits than others, and I'm always working on more than one thing. I'm never just working on one project, no matter how much I tell myself, this time we'll just do one thing. I am a jobbing writer, so people come along and say, will you do this? Or they'll be, can you check this, from this new foreign language edition, or could you just write this for this, or we need an interview here. There's always something else. So I've got at least 4 or 5 projects on the go, and it's just one then takes precedence until conclusion. Yeah.
So
sorry.
No, you carry on, Pete.
I was going to say, though, you've you finished obviously Moon Knight, and do you have another one that goes well with the Marvel Multiverse missions?
Well, we'll have to see how the sales go on this one. The next game book I'm doing is for Aconite, and it has been announced, but it's not Marvel. They're starting a series of Arkham Horror game books. So it's called A Darkness Over Arkham, and that has been announced on the official website. So yeah, I get to play in a different sandbox this time, but equally fun.
And also, that will have its own game system, but one based on standard as well, I imagine.
Yes, so it's not identical to, but it'll be certainly the stats and things will be very familiar to anybody who's played the Arkham Horror card game. And that's intentional, including the characters, so the people that you're...
Nice.
The idea in this one is you are, a bit like Fighting Fantasy, you are the hero, so you are the investigator. And at the start of the book, you'll have a choice of 3 named investigators from the game who you can play as. And their stats are min-maxed either way. So you'll have somebody who's obviously better at the esoteric knowledge, somebody's better at fighting, or the usual things. But then as you play the book, it will just be the typical, you do this, you do that. And obviously, and you'll have special rules, but they'll be in the adventure sheet. So you'll know how to apply them in the game without having to have it explicitly stated then. the hope is that in the future, if there are more of them, that you'll actually be able to take characters in one book and play another book with those characters.
Okay.
Yeah.
So because they'll have the same system, so you basically drop characters from different game books.
Yeah, and they might do things like downloads as here's a bonus character you can try with this one, things like that.
Okay.
But it's early days of that yet. But that's the plan.
Yeah, and of course they will have obviously a very different tone and format to like a Fighting Fantasy or Marvel game book, I assume.
Yeah, that's always one of the things that the first time around is quite tricky, and you've got to be very careful with doing tie-in fiction. Is exactly that. It's meeting the tone. Because while Arkham Horror is obviously Lovecraftian, it's not Lovecraft, and it's not as dark or as macabre as things like Call of Cthulhu probably take. So it's finding this is purely from me, but I'd guess it's like a PG-13 kind of rating. So the more grotesque elements would be implied rather than explicit. And it's not that you are insignificant and nothing you do makes any difference to these elder gods who they don't even have it in for you. You're just so minor that it's like stepping on an ant and it drives you mad. It's more the idea of, okay, here's some gribbly monsters, right, grab your shotgun, we can fight back. So it's slightly more optimistic.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of Brian Lumley's take on the Lovecraft universe, whereas he put it, my guys don't scream and they fight back.
Yeah.
Which is, that's fair enough. We still got all the tentacles and monsters of a typical Lovecraft story, but just you also got shotguns as well.
Yes.
Which apparently shotguns also considered magical weaponry when done point blank.
Oh, okay. That makes sense.
But yeah, one thing was like is when you kind of as you're plotting this what research did you do for these Lovecraft books? Arkham Horror books. Sorry.
I know. Obviously, I have a grounding in sort of Lovecraftian fiction. I've read Brian Lumley's, for example, as well as H.P. Lovecraft and others, and I've riffed off that kind of setting before in my own stories. I wrote a horror novella called The Serpent's Egg, which you can still download from Amazon. But with this one specifically, I did, get hold of a copy of the game, read all the world Bibles, read up on the investigators, and also Aconite published a series of Arkham Horror novels. Oh. So I've been reading my way through some of those as well to get, again, that idea of the tone and how characters are treated, how the sort of monsters, the in-game elements, how they're transferred to the real world. So, somebody reading the book will know that's a ghoul if they played the game, but it's not necessarily, somebody doesn't suddenly see this horrible thing crawling out of a sarcophagus and go, oh, that's a ghoul. They're thinking, what's this hideous kind of, it looks human, but it moves more like a dog, and this weird sound it makes. Is that an animal sound, or is it trying to speak? And that kind of element of it, which I quite enjoy.
Have you ever played Mansions of Madness?
I haven't, but yeah, that does have that whole setting equally plays into it as much as the basic card game.
Yeah, because I've been, there's a lot of interchange between Arkham Horror and Mansions of Madness. Yes. And yeah, I mean, my wife and I both love Mansions of Madness. We kind of love the investigation element and sneaking around and trying not to die.
Yeah, so certainly that is also part of the game book, is going to be that whole, it will lean into the investigation as much as here's some monsters. Fighting Fantasy, it's more a case of you turn up in a village, it's being terrorized by a giant. How are you going to solve the problem? You're going to fight it, or do you have this magical item to use? Whereas in this, it will be following the clues, following the breadcrumbs, and see where it leads.
Again, that kind of brings up this question: is how can game books mimic the structure of a investigation? Because I mean, it's not just go there, fight someone, stab it, yay, move on to the next mission. It's more go there, find the clues.
Yeah.
And get enough evidence, and then with the information you've accrued from all the clues, put it back to sleep, banish it or what have you.
Yeah.
So, can game books? How do you find that?
Well, I've done it before.
Okay.
In different ways. I co-wrote Steve Jackson's 40th anniversary Fighting Fantasy game book, Secrets of Salomonis, and in that there's a bit where you do an investigation, and depending on the things that you find out with the choices you make, you get clue points. and they're not all the same value. So once you then go to actually try and, when you think you've solved a problem, you add your clue points together and turn to that section. So any combination of them gives you a completely different section to turn to. So, and it then reflects on the knowledge you have of the options that are open to you. But we'll be doing things slightly differently with the Arkham Horror book. We just have to wait and see.
Okay. And but like going back to Marvel is, I think Marvel have done these Fantasy game books before, if I recall.
There have been some in the past.
Yeah.
I do have some somewhere, but I'm trying to think. I'm not sure that they actually had game rules. I think they're more likely to be more like your Choose an Adventure, which is just the branching narrative. And that for me is the difference. With a game book, it has to have some sort of game element with not necessarily rolling dice, but some sort of RPG element to it, rather than just the story now branches this way or that way. Because certainly when I read as a child the Choose Your Own Adventure, I know they have a massive following all around the world, but I found them unsatisfying because it was literally just we branched, and it's ended here, and they'd be completely different. Whereas I preferred the fact that it kind of all tied up together or it could intersect. I did one like that myself, Doctor Who. So I've written a couple of Doctor Who game books. The first one was The Horror of Howling Hill, which is effectively a branching narrative, but it is also a puzzle to solve. So it does tie up. But some of it does end up being a bit fudged because you think if you've all got to end up in the same place and having information. But then I did it a bit better with the second one I did, which was the 12th Doctor, Night of the Kraken. So I managed to play into that with sort of collecting objects would open up different options. And because of that, there are actually two completely different alien races behind the events in the story, depending on the route you take.
Okay. And I mean, like, obviously each game book requires its own system to apply the game element to it. And obviously you can't like have the same system up between different novels because obviously IP rights. So
Yeah.
do you have a kind of a preferred or almost, possibly a preferred system that you utilize?
I mean, I have to say with my own Ace game books, it's similar to Fighting Fantasy, shall we say, without being the same. And in mine, it's simultaneous combat rather than turn taking. And I do use initiative as well, so bringing that kind of RPG element. And I've also introduced other rules. There's always something, or not always, but in most of them, there's something called the pen is mightier. So you actually have the option of avoiding combats a certain number of times in the book, because obviously that's something which some people don't enjoy or they get worried near the end. So you can do that. And I'll often have another rule which will change the story. So I don't have luck in my books, but it may work for the better or for the worse, but you don't know until you played that option. So I've given it various names. So in the first one, Alice's Nightmare in Wonderland, it's called Curiouser and Curiouser. In The Wicked Wizard of Oz, it's called Somewhere Over the Rainbow. And for my next one, which is going to be called Shakespeare versus Cthulhu, it's called Where There's a Will.
That's amazing.
I mean, if I recall, like Fighting Fantasy now 40 years old.
Yep.
And I think I remember the first game book I ever played was Selling Port Blacksand, City of Thieves, and I think that's like 40 years old this year. In fact,
it is. Yeah, it was published on, I think it was the 1st of September. Was its 40th anniversary.
And the fact you can remember this off the top of your head, it's kind of scary.
No, that shows I've just been finishing off You Are the Hero, the 40th anniversary edition. That's all that tells you.
Okay, that makes sense.
I'm great at having this knowledge when I'm in the middle of a book, but then before I came on tonight, I did just have to go through my notepad to see, well, who else did I pitch for before Moonlight was accepted? Because I'm very good at then dumping all that information later and moving on. But I mean, one of the great things, you say Fighting Fantasy, it's got your classic 3 stats in most books, skill, stamina, and luck. But it's amazing how much flexibility that gives you and how many variations you can play on that. I remember there's one, I think it's in Death Trap Dungeon, which
That's the one
wrote.
That's the first one I ever had. Death Trap Dungeon was my first ever Fighting Fantasy book.
I think it's there because there's a cursed well or spring that you can drink from, and it actually boosts your stamina points because of the spell cast on it. But it was cast by a witch, so you also lose luck points at the same time. And I just love that. That's really, really clever.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like it's fact. We're still talking about it in 40 years. 40 years on, tells you that the strength of the book and how people still play into the sea, including myself. And One thing I want to ask as well is like apparently you're collaborating with Sir Ian. I love the fact that Ian Lewson has been knighted now, and he's officially Sir Ian. But you're collaborating with him on the art of fighting fantasy as well, aren't you?
Yes, and we've actually got a Zoom call about it tomorrow. So yeah,
even better. Yeah.
The text is almost there, almost there.
Oh, fantastic!
Yeah,
because I mean the artwork in those Fighting Fantasy, both the cover artwork and the interior artwork, is just phenomenal.
Oh yeah, stunning. Yeah. It's amazing. They again stood the test of time. Those classic covers, and it's weird how just because how copyright works, how many places they've cropped up. Death metal seems to be quite a good source. There's one of mine was Howl of the Werewolf, and the artwork for that's appeared on I think Heavy Metal magazine, and it's even been a tattoo on somebody's back.
Oh, nice.
Yes, nice.
Do you have to sign the back as well?
Oh no, I've only ever seen photographs, but it's quite cool because one of the photographs is the guy's wearing a T-shirt that looks like it's been ripped by claws, and you can see the werewolf through it behind it, which is quite nice.
Oh, nice.
Quality.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I suppose in some ways, like Fighting Fantasy spoiled me because I now expect artwork in game books now. Kind of because to add to that level of immersion, especially because like the way the artwork's done, it's not just done as a kind of a static scene. It's more like done from the perspective of the hero, where you are seeing what the hero's seeing, and it's kind of I expect that now in other game books.
Well, I'm the same because that's what I grew up. And, you know, there is occasionally the question does go on the various groups, does a game book need illustrations? It's like, well, no, but I would prefer to have them in mind, which is why it's a big reason why I actually crowdfund them, because artwork and quality artwork, you know, it's not cheap, and quite rightly so. It's somebody spent hours laboring over that. But I feel it really makes a difference. And it's also, I spend, you know, it's a long time, well, not to say long time, but it's an important part of the process is choosing the artist to make, because their art will also, before anybody reads any of your words, will set the expectations and tone for it, and they have to marry up. And sometimes I've asked people and they've said no, and in some cases that means I actually haven't written the book. So I did want to write an Ace game book based on the Journey to the West, the classic monkey. And I may still do it, but the artist I asked wasn't up for it at the time. I'll confess, it was Neil Googe, and he was relaunching Bazooka Jaws at the time. And I then went to a couple of years later and said, look, would you like to illustrate Ronin 47, which is kaiju versus mechs? And he went, okay then. So that was Ronin 47, which is the last published one. Yeah. And you know, that manga-esque look just looks completely different from any other Ace game book, but you know, it sells you a certain expectation in the story, and it's amazing the way he draws monsters, but also the
so good.
The
I remember being at your booth, not last year, last year, not the current one that's just passed, and loving the artwork for the mechs. It was absolutely they're so good, so good.
Yeah. And also
he did so many just design sketches in profile and elevations of the mechs before I even decided which ones I wanted. So in the hardback, the collector's hardback, I did put those sketches in the back of the book for people to enjoy as well. But yeah, I'm hoping if the sales going to make it worthwhile, I'd love to actually turn this one into a trilogy. I've got the ideas for the next 2 books and would love to have Neil back on board. But nice. It's always finding the time.
Will the sequel be Ronin 48 and then the final will be Ronin 49?
No, well, they're going to be Ronin 47 with the subtitles. So the next one's Ronin 47 Kaiju Killer.
All right, nice.
And I won't give away the third one yet, just in case it does become a thing.
Oh, nice.
Okay. And sorry, Mark.
I was going to say, just on a side note, because I'm looking through your website at the minute. There's you've got a Beowulf role playing game. Is that actually a role playing game, or is that a game book?
That is a role playing game. It's here on my desk. So there it is. Role playing in the world of Beowulf Beastslayer, because Beowulf Beastslayer was the 4th Ace game book I wrote. Right. And I've now turned it into an RPG. So normally RPGs lead to game books. I've gone the other way around. So it's got more complicated rules, but still quite rules light. But I'm very pleased with it. I think the layout's amazing. And the artwork, some of it commissioned for the book, some of it licensed from other artists, really is very cool. And not much of it is actually the rules. A lot of it is adventures. So there's the first 2 parts of the Beowulf adventure are in there. And depending on, again, time and finances, I'd like to get some supplements out which would finish the Beowulf story, but also I want to do a campaign based on like the Sons of Ragnar. So
that would be
they're
good.
historical characters, but give them that kind of, then give it a slightly fantastical twist. So Ivor the Boneless and yeah, all that sort of thing. I've got the ideas, it's just the time I don't have.
That would be good. That would be good.
But yeah, so that's the second role-playing game I've done. The first one I did, bizarrely, was based on my Christmas book, 'Twas the Krampus Night Before Christmas.
I saw that as well, yeah.
So there's 'Twas the role-playing game before Christmas. So this actually has various supplements, some of which are PDF only, but others are print on demand. So last year I released I'm not sure it's here. Oh, there it is. Yeah, the adventure calendar. So new content for every day in December.
Oh wow!
So those, I'd love to do more, but the trouble is, I write all of these things. So, and obviously, if people come along and paying gigs like Moonlight, that's obviously
that takes precedent.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And I said, how long did Moonlight take from? I imagine like almost the development stage where you're kind of discussing ideas with Marvel, that took the longest.
Well, when you mentioned that, I was just thinking about it actually, and I think the first notes I made were about a year ago. So when I was first brainstorming for different things.
Yeah.
So and then I can't remember, but I was writing it in January, and I can't remember what the deadline was now, but I think it was something like April to make sure it's all, because they get it printed in time. So it's already out in the States, but it's now on the copies for the UK are on a boat heading across the Atlantic at the moment. So it'll be out on the 23rd of November here.
Oh, nice. So just in time for Christmas.
Yeah. So I guess, like I say, that was from conception to actually having a copy of the book, it's about a year. But there's obviously lots of times in that where I'm doing nothing to do with Moonlight at all, but waiting for the next bit.
Yeah. Well, I mean, how long was that discussion stage with Marvel where you're going, I want to do this, and they're going, no, we can't do that.
Well, the good thing is that I have a great editor, Gwen Nix, and she's very used to working with Marvels. So she's my sounding board to begin with, and she will then pass things on. So she can save me wasting my time early on. And they're always having back to and fro conversations because they're writing all sorts of Marvel novels as well, just like the Arkham Horror. So they're quite hot on what's going to pass muster and what might not, and that's why they'll say, well, try for this character, but then have an alternative in case they say no, to have some flexibility. But yeah, so actually, and I'm being really vague now, but because I've got my head full of Fighting Fantasy at the moment, I can't remember how long it took different dates and things. I know that with the Arkham Horror one, that's been a lot quicker because we've got to try and get it out for next April. So
that's not long, really.
No, well, fingers crossed, I'll get feedback on the revised synopsis on Wednesday, and then it'll probably be all guns blazing on that one, which is why it's been good to get the Fighting Fantasy stuff finished.
Right, yeah. Okay. And so you can't say to Marvel, well, I want Moon Knight to be bitten by a radioactive spider, then hit by cosmic rays.
That sounds awesome. That sounds like going slightly that everybody suddenly becomes venomized route.
I like that idea.
Actually, isn't there in one of the alternative, there's Arachno Knight or something like that, where it is Moon Knight has Spider-Man's powers or vice versa.
They have done.
Sure, there is.
Yeah, that kind of, especially with the Spider-Verse, they have done lots of different interpretations of the Spider-Man character. But yeah, I think there's one there's the whole Venomverse, there's whole Carnage Spider-Man, which is frankly terrifying.
Yeah. I mean, one of the ideas, I've still got my Spider-Man idea on the back burner in case one day they think, yeah, actually, he's written a few books now, we'll trust it. So
let's let him go.
That'll be fun.
Oh yeah, I can imagine. And Spider-Man's kind of I think he's kind of Marvel's top-selling character at the moment.
Yeah, that's yes. I mean, that's why it's really hard to get.
Yeah.
I do. There is an oblique reference to it in Moon Knight, which got past the censors. So it's a really, really subtle reference, but technically Spider-Man's in my game book.
Nice, nicely done, sir.
Oh, amazing. Oh, I'm sorry. While you're talking, I'm sort of kind of going through all your list of things. You've got some non-fiction stuff. I've got one here. What is myrrh anyway? And it's everything you always wanted to know about Christmas.
That's right. I think that was published 15 years ago, wasn't it?
2008. It says, yeah. Would you ever go back to a non-fiction book? What if you did? What would you do? What would you think about doing?
Well, I'm just finishing a non-fiction book now. You Are the Hero. That's non-fiction history of Fighting Fantasy game books.
The definitive guide.
I suppose, yeah. Right, yeah.
Non-fiction book in the next couple of years, but I don't want to mention that just yet in case. But yes, I mean, I have interest in all sorts of things. One of the things I like about being a writer is part of having the different projects is the chopping and changing. It keeps it fresh.
Yeah.
And when you're finishing one project, you are looking forward to the next one. But then equally, it means that you never have writer's block, because if something isn't going well, you just put that one to one side and do something else. And it's like a palate cleanser. It's like when I used to write novels about 10 years ago, I'd really like to write a short story afterwards, because you spend so many months writing the novel and rewriting it. To then do something which can be finished in a couple of weeks just felt really satisfying.
Yeah. I mean, like, we talk about how game books have been around for 40 plus years, but I think what people fail to appreciate is that game books were many people's gateway into gaming and role-playing games. And like when I was doing interviews for that the chapter I wrote on role-playing games and the Satanic Panic and the history of them for Deviant Leisure, quite a few people were saying, it was, even before D&D, it was the game book, it was Fighting Fantasy. And that came about just through pure word of mouth, that people on the playground were playing these books.
Yeah, they didn't do a massive print run to begin with, and then they reprinted it so many times in the first year. And that was when Puffin went back and said, look, could we make this a series? And that's when they started writing them individually. It just took off.
I just remember, and I don't remember like a lot about, when I was very young, and it's got to be easily, when was this going to be? I would have been 10 years old, possibly. I want to say 9 or 10 years old, and I just remember we used to have like this book fair in school, and you could go into the assembly hall, and they had all these books sort of kind of set out, and you could sort of kind of put your orders down. And I remember seeing Death Trap Dungeon. It's seeing this book with this horrendous looking sort of kind of like slug creature with its sort of tongue sort of kind of the big thing coming out, and just automatically go, that is the coolest thing. That's like everything else was all like kids books and sort of like now. And then there was just like this, and I had no idea what it was. I was just like, that's cool, and I want that, so put my name down for it. And I remember
exactly. I was going to put you in there, Matt. It's like what you said about the cover. It's exactly point on. I mean, as I understand it, probably like the publishers was saying they wanted like a typical 70s, 80s fantasy, a pixie or fairy on a pumpkin, and Ian Livingstone and Steve
Jackson.
Thank you. My mind just went blank for a second. Steve Jackson went, no, we want a monster looking at the viewpoint going to kill you.
Yeah.
Something hideous and monstrous, and which is utterly, and because that was so different, it stood out. And I think, as I said, they barely had any advertising or any promotion. And I mean, this is like pre-internet. And all the promotion they had was pure word of mouth. And at one point, they had the top 3 books in the bestseller list.
Yeah, Sunday Times bestsellers.
Through no kind of advertising, no promotion, just children in the playground and sharing with their friends, sharing with their family, sharing with everyone, and just exploding.
And readers of White Dwarf magazine as well.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. But like I had, I'm trying to think. What year did that come out? When did Death Trap Dungeon come out? What year was?
That was 1984, because it's the 40th anniversary for that one next year.
Yeah. Right. So I definitely didn't get it when I was born in 81, so I definitely didn't get it when I was 3. But it would have been around when I was 8 or 9 years old that it came out, and I think like Games Workshop was obviously starting off in and around then, and obviously Dungeons and Dragons. But I just remember seeing this book and having no idea what it was, thinking I was going to take it home and I could just read it normally, and then realizing that it was something I could partake in, and I just being like completely just like, oh my god, this is one of the coolest things I've ever seen. And then sort of kind of finding out about D&D, and then my dad one day came back from I think he'd been in England, but he came back with this book called Rogue Trader, and I was like, what the hell is this? And then it's like, Space Marines, and I had all the D&D, and I was just like, my love affair, and it all sort of kind of stemmed from me showing interest in this single book, and then sort of kind of them kind of, well, he kind of likes the fantasy side of thing, and then sort of coming off and giving me these things like D&D and obviously Warhammer.
When you mentioned about reading the book or picking up and reading, realizing it wasn't a conventional book, my gran was the first member of my family to read my very first Fighting Fantasy game book, Spellbreaker. And she got to the end, she said, I didn't really understand it. And she'd read it from cover to cover. And I explained, no, you meant to turn to the different pages. She's like, oh, okay.
I just remembered.
That was so lovely of her. She stuck through it. It must just be me. But...
She was like, I'll be nice to him. I'll not tell him it makes no cohesive sense. And, it's well written. It's just not, it's not my thing. Yeah. But I just remembered just falling into a pit trap. Like one of my first deaths was sort of like, I just remember sort of like turning a page after making a bad decision and ending up in a pit trap or something, and I was like, god damn it. And I very fondly remember that death moment. I don't know why, but it's stuck there. I think there was a picture of a trap as well.
I remember my first experience was like say a City of Thieves, and I met a friend on holiday, one in Spain or somewhere, and he shared this book with me. And so I started reading it, and I got to the I had no experience of game book up until then. It's like it must be like my age about 8 or 9, possibly 10. I don't know what to do. Maybe I got the first decision. What do I do? I said, just go to that chapter, do that. Okay, so I went to that one. So I started reading a bit more. It's another. What do you mean I've got to make another decision? So what do I do? You make your own decision.
Yeah.
Oh, so 5 finger bookmarks it became.
Yeah. Oh yeah, the classic.
Yeah. And I mean, how game books evolved since then?
Oh yes. I mean, you've got various different series. For example, Destiny Quest, which Michael J. Ward has got. He's launching on Kickstarter in October. Destiny Quest Raiders, which is an evolution again. But when he wrote this, it was capturing the kind of feel of games like World of Warcraft as a game book. So where you can level up characters and you can, by the different abilities and items, you can effectively tailor make your own character, and then having different quests you can try at different levels, which gives you the freedom of an open world map. I'm trying to find several in the book, and I know I won't be able to find one. But anyway, and they have different icons on them, and you can, depending on the level, the difficulty level. So certain people like him have certainly tried to give them a fresh feel and change things. It's not always the same 2 dice rolling, which I admit mine are mostly, and lots of people are, because it's Fighting Fantasy.
Steve Jackson kind of really experimented with his game books. I mean, he wrote Starship Traveller, which kind of very. Did he write Starship Traveller?
He did, yeah.
Yeah.
He never liked repeating himself, so he did. Once they were writing by themselves, he did Citadel of Chaos, which is your classic fantasy adventure, but in a castle rather than being a dungeon this time. Then he did Starship Traveller, which is science fiction. He wrote House of Hell, which is contemporary horror.
Yeah.
Appointment with Fear, which was Golden Age superheroes.
Yeah.
Creature of Havoc, where you are the monster. The Sorcery Epic, which is using the magic system, having to learn the spells and having an adventure span across 4 books.
Did he also write Robot Commando? And
no, that was US Steve Jackson. So,
right. Okay. Yeah.
So Steve Jackson games
and that brought in mechs as well.
Yes. So, and I think Robot Commando is pretty open world as well, and you have multiple paths to victory. But he wrote Scorpion Swamp and Demons of the Deep as well. They were both the US Steve.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's also, I think, another kind of vehicle-based one was Highway Warrior.
Freeway Fighter is the
Freeway
Fighting
Fighter,
Fantasy.
sorry.
I
Yes.
think Highway Warrior might be Joe Deaver's take on that. I
Yeah.
can't remember the name of the series, but there were about, I think it was 4 that Joe Deaver did, which were similar kind of Mad Max vibe. That's what I'm trying to say. Yes.
Yeah, like they had, you had like one that's for yourself, one that's for the car, and
Yeah, in Freeway Fighter, it's the Dodge Interceptor. That's an Ian Livingstone book, and when I say they, I was involved partly, but when there was the comic based on that, one of the variant covers for issue 1 was the adventure sheet from the game book, which has the car with its missiles and tires and things. Yeah.
Oh, that's very nice. And yeah, I recognise actually the artwork from Freeway Fighter, because I think it was from Dark Future originally, or vice versa.
The first one, I think, was an original painting by Jim Burns, and then when Wizard Books published it in the noughties, they had a different cover painting by Jim Burns, but it was used on battle cars.
That's my one. Yeah,
so I
that's
don't
my
have that one to hand, but yeah.
I've got it upstairs. It's in one of the kids' rooms, and I'm not going to disturb them just because I get something thrown at me.
Fair enough.
Okay, but yeah, but like I say, like the system, like despite its simplicity, is incredibly flexible, or because of its simplicity, is incredibly flexible.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of evolving, people are always adding new rules or time tracks or things. One of the things I've tried to do with most of my Ace game books is you can play as more than one character in many of them, and the story will change according to which character you are. And I've also, for the first time with Dracula Curse of the Vampire, you can change character during the story, and what one character's done will have an impact on what other characters experience as a result. So although for example, you can play as John Seward, Jonathan Harker and Mina Murray, and if you play as all 3, it's potentially easier to complete, except that Dracula's more likely to get more powerful than if you just played as one. Yeah. And I have a habit of you can play as the bad guy as well, so you can play as Dracula in that one and try and defeat the vampire hunters. In Wicked Wizard of Oz, you can play as the Wicked Witch of the West. In Neverland, you can play as Captain Hook.
Amazing.
Yeah.
You say that, and incredibly offhand, but the fact that I was thinking about it and the complexity that must require, and the flexibility of the system, and maintaining the game balance and maintaining narrative flow is
that's why
mind-blowing.
Dracula's that big.
Hence why you got like a 3-inch fake.
When I finished writing the Vampire Hunter stories, I think it was about 800 sections. So then there's 200 that are dedicated purely to Dracula's story. You can't change characters. If you choose to play as Dracula, you are Dracula all the way through. You can't chop and change.
Okay. And what's like, where do you go from here? I mean, like you have kind of almost established yourself as the game book guy or the game book writer.
Well, I've got various projects that people have asked me to do. So it's I've got, like I say, there's the Arkham Horror game book I'm working on next. I've got more Ace game books I want to do. I've got a massive list. I mean, I've got several plotted out in quite a lot of detail. For some reason, around the year before the pandemic, I seem to plot several, and I still haven't written them all yet. So I don't know how many. I'm always torn because I like to share the ideas, I guess, because I'm vain. But I don't want to give anything away because somebody might write it before I have the chance to. But as I've said already, the next one's going to be called Shakespeare versus Cthulhu. And there was a short story anthology which I actually crowdfunded and edited about 7 years ago, which was Shakespeare versus Cthulhu. But this is my game book take. So it's not an adaptation of the short story anthology. It's a new story. Well, I say it's new, but in that one you are William Shakespeare. So.
One bit that's popped in mind is, I mean, Tin Man Games did that did the Fighting Fantasy app. Have you ever been tempted to kind of adapt your game books into an app? Yes.
There was one company which were developing the first one, Alice, as a game book app, and it unfortunately came to naught. But I've been in touch with another company, but they're pretty busy at the moment, so we've sort of scheduled a discussion for early next year, but we'll see. But yes, if anybody's listening to this and would like to turn my game books into apps, there's the possibility that there might be an audio version of one of them. But again, I don't want to sort of jinx things. So
that'll be good.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, like, I almost feel like given the size of the screen and that each section is actually not a full length of text, but just a section of text, it feels a natural fit for a handheld device.
Yeah. I mean, one of the nice things is my Ace Game books have been published overseas. So Alice has got the most different language editions, but it's, I think it's about 11 different countries now have published one or more of my Ace Game books, including Japan, Poland, Italy. Spain's coming soon because the book's finished. Where else? Argentina, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czech Republic, Brazil, France. Yeah.
How do you quality control a different language that you don't speak?
That's a tricky one. Fortunately, the people I've been working with seem to have pretty good reputation and they've done a good job. What's really good is when they, say my German publisher, the translator's amazing and he's spotted a few mistakes. So some of the reprints of the English versions have included his corrections. Because he's just so sharp-eyed and so meticulous.
Oh, wow.
Which is always nice to have that opportunity. So, but yeah, because I have heard horror stories of the past where certain game book series were translated and they weren't done particularly well. But so far, touch wood, it seems to have been okay.
Nice. Cool. Right. Well, we've been nattering on for an hour and a quarter. We'll not subject you to the obligatory pop quiz tonight. But it's been an absolute pleasure. Really looking forward to seeing what you've got going on next, and we will no doubt see you at UKGE next year.
Oh yes.
Also, I think UK Games Expo this year, I was hoping to see Ian Livesden and pick up his copy of Dice Men, but he wasn't there on the Saturday and Sunday. He had a family emergency he had to respond to, unfortunately.
Sounds like an excuse. He just wanted to see you, Pete. That's what it is.
That's probably just as true. I've interviewed him so many times, he knows me.
But yeah, man, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks very much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Moon Knight is currently available.
Yeah, so you can get it in the UK. You can get it as an ebook, well, global ebook, and the paperback will be out in end of November.
Awesome.
Excellent.
Right.
And if you're listening in the States, it's out now, so please do buy it and write a review.
Right. Well, much appreciated. For me, I've been Matt Geary. With me has been Peter Allison.
Good night, everyone.
And our special guest, Jonathan Green.
Good night. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye.